website.
Yep. So I am officially recording it.
Okay, I think I'm going to go ahead and start. I'm hoping most everybody is wanting to join this seminar has joined. I'm Dr. Tom Perls. I'm the director of the New England Centenarian study and the number of studies that I'm going to describe later that some of you are a part of, or your parent was, or is. I'm going to be leading this talk that will be for about half an hour, describing our studies, some of our findings, hopefully to make you think of some questions that you'd like to ask, because we're leaving about half an hour for some questions that I and some other panel members that I'll introduce shortly will attempt to answer. Okay, so this talk is certainly pretty much encompasses what we do, which is centenarians and their families. Next slide, please. So as part of this talk, I want to introduce to you some key people that are participating, are on our panel and available and ready to answer questions. Dr. Stacy Andersen is an assistant professor of medicine here at Boston University, the co-director of all our studies, and a principal investigator of a number of our grants, mostly from the National Institutes of Health. Professor Paola Sebastiani is in the Department of Medicine and leads the biostatistics effort at Tufts Medical Center, and has pretty much from the beginning been a principal investigator of our studies. Rena Karki is our senior research project manager. Some of you may have spoken with Rena in the past and certainly have had correspondence with her, as is the case for the following three people. Brad Petrowitz is one of our research project managers. Some of you will be very interested to know that Brad hails from Michigan and went to the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. We have an unusually large number of participants in our study from Michigan. Lan Sansoshi is another of our research project managers. He specializes in helping manage our data collection. And Adriana Hernandez is also another of our research project managers, particularly for a new study that I'm going to describe called RADCO, and you'll hear what that stands for in a little bit. I remind you that there's the opportunity through the chat to ask your questions, and we will get to those at the end of my talk, which again is going to be about 25 minutes long or so. You have the option to anonymize yourself so that your name doesn't show up with your question, or you can just leave it and your name will show up. So please pay attention to that. Okay, next slide. So Stacy and I started the New England Centenarian study back when we were at Harvard Medical School back in 1995. And I imagine that some of the folks on today listening may have a relative who was enrolled not too long after that, in the late 90s, early 2000s. And indeed, we have some offspring of centenarians who have been with our study for a very long time, since the early 2000s. So we are indeed a longitudinal study. Most of you are aware that we do our best to contact you regularly to update our information. And we, in fact, have even contacted you for a new blood sample so that we can collect longitudinal data, which is just really important for a study like this. So we can start looking at things like rate of change, and just instead of just one bit of data at one point in time. We just thought we'd throw in a few pictures here of some of our subjects, our participants, I should say, and family members, that it highlights the fact that at least pre-COVID, we were gathering much of our data in person. And then with the very unfortunate advent of COVID, we transitioned to collect most of our data by Zoom calls, very much like this, except where you can interact with the research assistant, and we collect information like your neuropsychological data and so on over the Zoom. The picture on the left of Stephen visiting one of our wonderful participants, they're all wonderful, was when he was there to visit for about 15-20 minutes to collect a blood sample. For people who are living within about 3 hours driving of Boston, we really love the opportunity to come and visit if it is just for a blood sample. And then otherwise, a person from a national phlebotomy service comes and collects the blood. Sorry, I'm trying to understand, Brad. What should we be doing about the Q&A? It's not a chat, but rather I think people do have the chance to write a question in, and we will get to those down at the end of the talk.
Yep, I just wanted to make it clear there are separate chat and Q&A sections at the bottom of your screen. So the chat is disabled, but the Q&A is where you can put your questions that we'll be able to answer at the end.
Oh, perfect. Thanks, Brad. Next slide, please. So many of you are aware of this, but centenarians are special in part because of just how rare they are. The 100-year-olds, as you'll see down in the bullets, are about 1 per 5,000 people in our population. And then as each year passes, people become extraordinarily rare. It's really more exponential in how fast the rarity becomes, so that 105-year-old occurs in our population about 1 per 250,000 in the population. And people who are 110 and older, what we call super centenarians, are 1 per 5 million in the population. And at any one time, there's about 65 or 70 super centenarians in the country. In part because the New England Centenarian Study has been around for quite a while, we have the largest sample of centenarians. Many have passed away. A number are, as you show us, are alive, obviously. But we have about 2,500 centenarians and their children in the study currently. Next slide, please. Oh, and this is a picture of our, go back one, thanks. This is a picture of our oldest ever participant, Sarah Knaus, who was 119, and there in the photo is her great 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 grandson. That was a family of 6 living generations that we enrolled into the study, and we have had a number of instances where we not only have the centenarian in the study, but also their centenarian child. So the original centenarian may have passed away, and then their children come through the study, and as you know, having a centenarian parent puts you at a much greater chance yourself of going on to 100. Next slide. I should also say that Sarah was the second oldest and has continued to hold that record, the second oldest ever in the world. The first oldest was Madame Comment, who died at the age of 122 in 1997. There is a woman in Japan who is knocking on the door of that second oldest record. She's 118, I think almost 119, and then we'll just see how far along she gets there. Maybe she'll take over that record. Now, a really fabulous trait of our centenarians is that we find that about 90% of them are disability free up through their early to mid 90s. And they really embody this idea of the older you get, the healthier you've been. Now, just because they're independent up through that very long period of time doesn't mean that they haven't had some diseases along the way, whether that be heart troubles or a stroke, some what would otherwise be pretty devastating diseases. The centenarians had this history of managing these problems much, much better, living with them, and even being independent up through their early 90s. So even if they have no diseases up through the age of 100, what we call escapers, even though about 85% of these folks were not escapers, they're still doing remarkably well, which speaks to some really important resilience and reserve that we're very, very interested in trying to understand. Now, with super centenarians, people who live to 110, they seem to do very, very well, really up to the age of 105 or 106. And so the people who are escapers, those who have nothing really at 100, they obviously have a greater chance of becoming these super centenarians who are doing very well up to about 106 or so. And so they compress both the time that they're sick as well as avoiding disability to really very much the end of their extremely long lives. Next slide, please. One of the interesting things about 110 versus 100 is that living to 100, the people who get there can still be pretty different from one another, at least in terms of if and when they're going to develop some kind of age-related disability or disease, remembering still that they avoid disability up through their early to mid 90s. But they can still be a pretty heterogeneous or mixed group of people in terms of their clinical characteristics. But when you look at people who are 110, they're incredibly alike in terms of avoiding, delaying their diseases and disability towards the very end. And because they are so very alike, they even more so than the 100-year-olds probably have some really important factors. We think genetic variants. We all have the same genes, just different variations of those genes. So they probably have some variations, particularly in common, that allow them to get to those extreme ages. And as a result, for the kind of studies that we do and others who study relatively rare traits or even common traits, you may need tens of thousands of individuals in a study to be able to figure out what they have in common, what they don't, and the underlying biological mechanisms that either are predisposing them to a disease or protecting them from a disease. In the case of our centenarians, and particularly the older ones, we don't think we need such a large sample. So now we are really on the verge of having enough participants, I think, to really make some what should be transforming discoveries in the area of healthy aging. The other thing we realized in terms of at least the genetic factors, and Professor Sebastiani has really led this effort and is internationally renowned for this. The genetic factors that the centenarians have seem to protect them from aging, help slow down the rate of aging and delay aging-related diseases, most importantly to me, Alzheimer's disease. And they don't seem to necessarily lack genetic variants that might predispose them to diseases. They seem to have just as many of those variants, except for a few, as the rest of the population. What really sets them apart, and I would say the children of centenarians as well, are very much predisposed to this. It's not to say that you definitely have these genetic variants, but you certainly are at markedly increased chance of having them compared to the general population, is these protective variants. And that's a really neat thing, because if we understand what's protecting you, we might be able to, are hoping to discover the biological mechanisms that these genes are governing, are promoting. And once we know protective biological mechanisms, then it's not too far away to then try and develop drugs that do the same thing. Drugs that would protect other people as well from, hopefully, not just, you could age more slowly, I suppose, but more importantly, I think, would be that it would help delay or even escape a disease like Alzheimer's disease. Next slide. I wanted to mention to you our funded studies from the National Institutes of Health. And you are certainly in one of these if you're a participant listening in now. There's the Integrative Longevity Omics study, what we call ILO, the Longevity Consortium Centenarian Project, and the Long Life Family Study. And then most recently, Rena, if you just tap your space bar for the next slide, we have a new study, RADCO, called Resilience and Resistance Against Alzheimer's Disease in Centenarians and Offspring. And some of you who are in these other studies, we may ask you, depending upon how your cognitive function is and a few other factors, if you'd be willing to be in this latest study of ours, which would basically be collecting the same data that you have now, but we add a few things, which I will talk about at the end when I mention some of the data and biological materials that we collect from our participants, just to give you an idea of just how involved the study is and how remarkable it is, some of the things that we're finding out and collecting. Next slide, please. So here is a list of the data that we collect, and I'll mention the special data that we collect for that most recent, pretty large study, RADCO. Dr. Andersen is in charge of working with the research assistants to make sure they're all properly trained and doing exactly the same thing in terms of collecting careful and detailed cognitive function data from our participants. And we again do that over a medium like this through a Zoom call. And we also collect about a week's worth of physical and sleep function data through a really neat watch that you just wear on your wrist. And Lance Sansochi, who I mentioned to you as one of our research managers, is in charge of that effort. As you might know, and as you might guess, we are very interested in collecting as much family pedigree data as possible so that we can really understand how much longevity is running in one's family, and perhaps some other information that we collect about diseases and so on. The family pedigree, as we collect that information from our participants, it also gives us an opportunity to determine if there's some other participants that might be able in your family that we might be able to ask to be in the study as well. We collect medical and dental history, dietary habits, and intake. And then for RADCO, if you live in, and you're enrolled in that study and live in the Los Angeles, New York, Atlanta, or Boston areas, we ask if you might be willing to undergo a brain MRI that takes just about 15 minutes for the short one, and add another 15 minutes if you're willing. For biological samples, we collect a blood sample, and sometimes we ask if we can do that maybe every couple of years, again, so that we can collect data over time and see what changes, if any, a person is going through in terms of some of the blood markers that we collect, some of the biological markers. We also have recently, because there's been so much incredible interest for good reason in the bacteria in our guts, in our colon in particular. It's a very symbiotic relationship between us and our bacteria. We produce substances that go into the gut that the bacteria like, and on the other side of the coin, the bacteria make at least 100 different metabolites, if not, actually there's 100 that we can measure. They make about 1,000 that enter our bloodstream and have just as strong effect in some cases as other substances that our own organs make and so on, that play really, really important roles in all kinds of function, including brain function. And it's a very symbiotic relationship, and a number of diseases have been shown to have their basis based upon some derangements and problems with some bacteria that can collect in the gut. And very, very interestingly, the bacteria that we have in our gut, some of that is determined by our genes. It's just an enormously fascinating and interesting field, and we want to be sure to be gathering stool samples from our participants so that we can better understand what role the bacteria are playing perhaps in your longevity and delay or escape of aging-related diseases. I think it's a pretty sure bet that they are playing a role. We want to see how much of a role, and we want to see what they're producing that is causing that to happen, or at least contributing to it. The other really important thing that we're doing that costs a lot of money, but is so incredibly important, and the NIH is covering all of this, is is that we have a very special person at Boston University, George Murphy, who runs the regenerative, the Center for Regenerative Medicine, what they call CREM. They are able to take blood cells that we collect from some of our participants and turn them into what are called stem cells And this is all done in a petri dish and in the lab. And these cells can then be, some things can be done with these cells to turn them into specific tissue cells, like certain brain cells, a liver cell, a heart cell. And then we can use those cells for studies in test tubes to try and understand how your genes and some other factors may be helping those systems, those cells, age slowly and avoid things like Alzheimer's disease. It is incredibly fascinating and enabling what that technology is allowing us to do. And lastly, mostly for the participants that are in RADCO, we ask them, it's not required, but we ask them to be willing to donate their brain after they die, of course, and that they can be living anywhere in the country. The brain is removed at the funeral home and then quickly taken to a neuropathology lab at UCLA, one of our study partners, where a huge amount of study is performed, including genetic studies and so on. But very importantly, we want to see if there's evidence or not of something like Alzheimer's disease in the brain. Some of our participants have that evidence, but they, when they were alive, had no evidence of cognitive impairment. And we call these people resilient, that, or even they, where they have evidence of the disease, but they're not expressing it. And we are just at the beginning of trying to understand how people are resilient. And then there are people who have no evidence of Alzheimer's disease on autopsy. And of course, they were doing very well cognitively while they were alive. We call those people resistant. And we want to find out how resistance can happen. And I will say again, for those individuals who are either very cognitively intact at 100 and older, and some who just have the normal cognitive function of a centenarian, we'll be asking you after we've done the cognitive function testing to see if you might be willing to be in RADCO. It won't entail that much more in terms of your involvement, unless perhaps you're in one of those cities I mentioned where we can do an MRI. So next slide, please. I've really already mentioned where we are heading with a lot of the data that we're collecting. I mentioned the stem cells, which is just an incredibly powerful and exciting tool. We, for right now, are only collecting those from some folks because it really is a very expensive thing, and we only have so much money from the NIH. But as things goes forward, I think depending upon the success of those studies, and I'm very confident actually that those are going to be very successful with those stem cells, we'll be able to make a case with the NIH to get a lot more money to do many more lines. So you may well be asked in the future if you'd be willing to provide a sample of blood for that study. I mentioned already how we are just so interested in resilience and resistance in our Alzheimer's disease, to Alzheimer's disease. The gut microbiome study is incredibly exciting. I just might mention that what that involves is we send you a kit where we, don't send everybody on the call a kit, but certainly our participants, where it's a fairly simple process of, pardon my French, but you poop in a little a catch basin or that you put across the toilet seat, and that catches some of your stool, and you take a little scoop and put that in a little tube, and then screw the cap, and if you don't do that, maybe you have a nurse or somebody, if you're at assisted living or nursing home, they can help you, or a family member can help you. I hope it doesn't sound disgusting. I hope that you realize that the science is just so compelling and interesting that you'll realize that, and it's really worth the effort. The tube is then put in an envelope that we provide you with, and then that's just put in the mail and sent to us. So it really is a very simple process. And I just, from the bottom of my heart, ask you to please participate in that part of our study and give us that stool sample, because I think it's going to be very important. All of this is just, all of what we are doing has the goal of discovering drugs and strategies to slow aging and prevent Alzheimer's disease and other aging-related diseases. I mean, there are other things. We have other goals as well, but that's our primary goal. I think another goal I personally have, in part as a geriatrician, is just providing, I think, an accurate and albeit a very optimistic view about aging, its opportunities, healthy aging, and to really spread the word about our wonderful centenarians and their families. So the next slide. With that, we are at the end of my presentation, and we received a few questions already by email that we've divvied up amongst myself, Dr. Andersen, and Dr. Sebastiani. And so I think Stacy Andersen will run this segment to answer a couple questions we already have and have received, and then she'll go through the questions all of you have asked, and one of us will answer those. So Dr. Andersen, please take over.
Great. So again, feel free to use the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. If you just move your mouse, that'll pop up and you can type your question in there, and we'll answer as many as we can. And just to start off very quickly, I've been working on the study for 20 years, and I'm very excited to see many very familiar names showing up as participants. So it's great to see everyone. All right, so let's jump right in. We've had a couple of questions about whether the slides will be made available after the webinar, and we will post them on our website, the Centenarian Study website, along with a recording of this whole webinar. Okay, so we had a great question. My mother was in the New England Centenarian study until she passed at almost 108 years of age. Both her mother and brother lived to 101, but they were not in the study. Just wondering if you are interested in having me in the study, but I'm only 78 at this time. First, wow, your family's incredible. And second, yes, if you are the child or a sibling of a centenarian, regardless of whether your centenarian relative is still alive, we would love to include you in our study. So please reach out to us by phone or email, and you can find that on the newsletter that we sent out, or the email address that this webinar invitation came from. Okay, and then we had a question. What have we learned about the children of centenarians? So Dr. Perls talked a lot about centenarians themselves, but we've actually also been following their children for about 20 years. And people often wonder why we study the children of centenarians, because they aren't themselves long-lived. Most of them have not yet reached age 100, although we have had a handful. But over the years, we've found that many of the children of centenarians do have longer survival than their peers. And they also show half the rate of aging-related diseases and disability, including cognitive impairment. So they do seem to be following in their parents' footsteps. They do have a healthy aging profile. And what's really great about studying younger people who are predisposed to longevity, or more likely to live a long life, is that we can learn about the course of their health and function throughout life and look at how it has changed over their lifetime. Because certainly health and function aren't static throughout our lives. But we can also look at behavioral and psychological factors that contribute to healthy aging. So we've looked at things like personality factors among the children of centenarians. And we found that they're low in neuroticism, so they tend not to worry about things that they can't change, which presumably translates to lower stress levels. And they're high in extroversion, meaning that they tend to be outgoing, positive, and active, which probably helps to keep their cognitive and social engagement high throughout life. And we've even found that they have high levels of purpose in life, or a feeling of meaning and direction in their life compared to their peers. So it really shows that there are many things that contribute to living a long and healthy life. And I know that Dr. Sebastiani is really excited to examine the longitudinal blood samples that we've collected from many of the centenarian offspring and that we're continuing to do right now. I don't know if you wanted to add a point about that.
Absolutely. What we are trying to understand is there are particular genes that we have identified over the years that are supposed to be protective. So they protect, they really decrease the risk of Alzheimer's disease and increase the ability to maintain good cognitive function as people age and reach extreme old ages. So now we are collecting longitudinal data to try to understand better the biological mechanism through which this happens. We are in the middle of collecting data, so we don't know the answer yet. Hopefully we'll know soon, but we really have very, very promising data that some of the results could really be used to help everybody age in a healthy way. That's our goal, our primary goal.
Great. Here is a question from the Q&A box. My 106-year-old aunt, who was part of the study, succumbed to COVID early in the pandemic. Do you know if centenarians in general are more or less susceptible to COVID than other seniors?
I could answer that. There have been a number of publications now that have looked at centenarians. I don't think that they were more resistant to getting COVID, but they seem to deal with it better. We have a number of centenarians in the study, and from what I've read from other studies, they manage the disease much better. And there is some evidence that the immune systems of centenarians are remarkable and may play a role in why they delay some diseases where immune function is really important, not just infectious diseases like COVID, but also things like heart disease and even Alzheimer's disease, where inflammation is a really important part of the puzzle.
Tom, if you like, I like to add one thing, because we are actually doing a lot of work in this area, try to really characterize or discover what are the factors, genetics or environmental, that have helped centenarians to respond to infections. And one thing that is very clear, we have data that we haven't published, we're working and we will publish soon. But one thing that is very clear is that many centenarians we have analyzed have actually had experienced really serious infections. And the infections leaves like a fingerprint in your blood, in your DNA. So there is a sign that, well, not in your DNA, but in your blood. So there is a sign that you have had, you've been exposed to serious infection. And the explanation of this data is that these people were able to put a really robust response to infection. And I think this has happened a lot for COVID too. We have a lot of anecdotal. We will have more data. We are collecting a lot of data. We will have much more data to answer this question in a more scientific way. But anecdotal evidence suggests that there are really strong response from the immune system that has helped in the past and helps now.
And the only other thing, thanks, Paola. The only other thing I would add to that is, anecdotally, many centenarians that I've spoken with say they've never had a cold in their life, which is really interesting. And I think it's, while Paola said they may have had a severe infection, maybe avoiding a pneumonia or something like that is hard to do. But there are some viral, whereas most people get a cold once a year, these centenarians say they can't remember the last time they had a cold, and surely they had a cold in the past. But I do think there is something to that. Okay, Stacy.
Great. We had another question come in the Q&A. My grandmother lived to her early 90s. My mother lived to her early 100s. Do you expect that the average age of death will increase over time, over generations, for the children of centenarians or even for the entire population?
I do to some degree. I mean, obviously, medicine has made great strides. And in the early on, certainly it was vaccinations and surgeries and obstetrical care. And then in the 1970s, it began to be treatment of high blood pressure, or even in the 60s to some degree, but then later in the later on becoming really quite effective in treatment of high blood pressure and people with high cholesterol. We came up with medicines for that. And then there's been most recently, I think, some big strides in cancer care. So there are going to be offspring who might have otherwise died in their 90s, who, because of these advancements, have the opportunity to get even older. So I do think in general, the age of offspring, their age of survival or age of death is going to creep up compared to that of offspring of, say, 20, 30 years ago when they died. As far as lifespan is concerned, the ability to get beyond the age of 122, if there's going to be somebody, I wouldn't be surprised that there'll someday be a person who gets to 123, but that's one person out of billions. I don't see ages getting much higher than that. Our bodies are, they have a warranty, and for some of us, and for many on this call, it's an extended warranty. But even that has to come to an end.
And actually, we have a somewhat related question. Can I expect to live longer if I take good care of myself?
Oh, absolutely. Some centenarians give these fun stories or funny stories of really doing everything they can to kill themselves with drinking too much. Maybe they're even smoking. And what I mean by drinking too much is, I met a guy who was drinking 3 drinks a day in the afternoon, evening, and he was smoking, and he was still repairing his roof. He was 100 years old. He lived down in Fall River, but I promise you that is very, very rare. I mean, as rare as our super centenarians. And if he hadn't done those things, he probably would have lived to 110. Which speaks to the fact that it's never too late to have healthy behaviors. What are healthy behaviors? I would say those are things like certainly not smoking, not drinking alcohol, You know, I also feel it's important to balance things. You don't want to necessarily avoid things that you enjoy. And if that means having a nice glass of wine with dinner, I'm not going to say don't drink. There's a balance to everything in terms of extremes and so on. I think avoiding meat is a good idea for a number of reasons. There's a lot of epidemiological data out there. Certain populations that avoid meat, they live longer. It plays an important role, I think, in cardiovascular disease and cerebrovascular disease, things like stroke. So I think, you know, again, it's like that glass of wine. If you enjoy meat, maybe you could at least decrease the amount that you eat each week. Maybe you just do that once a week, and replace that with things like, and it's red meat. So you know, I think fish and chicken is okay. Choosing your parents well is really important. I kind of kidding there, but many of you have done that exceptionally well. Cognitive, Dr. Andersen, well, I think I'm going to let her talk about the importance of being cognitively active. Besides avoiding meat, the other piece to nutrition is being at a healthy weight. And I would say for older women, being a bit overweight has been shown to actually be good. And that may help decrease your risk of osteoporosis, because you know, you're having to carry more weight. That makes your muscles stronger, makes your bones stronger. Maybe that's the reason. But you don't want to be too overweight. You want to be at what feels like a healthy weight to you. And lastly, exercise. And I really love to see centenarians exercising, and I see it all the time. They're both weight training, where they're building muscle just with some weight exercises, but also going out for a brisk walk, being in the pool, other things to do what we call aerobic exercise. I think all these things are really important, and exercise has been shown to be very helpful for cognitive function as well. Dr. Andersen, maybe you want to speak to the issue of cognitive resilience and being cognitively engaged.
Yeah, so I was going to echo your comment about exercise, because the things that keep our heart healthy are what keep our brains healthy as well. So that's my #1 recommendation. But everyone always wants to know what they can do to keep their brain sharp. Should they be playing online games, doing crossword puzzles, taking supplements that are out there? But really, from the evidence that we've had, the two biggest things are exercise, physical activity, even going for a brisk walk, and then doing something new and novel that you really have to pay attention and engage your cognitive resources. So if you've never used a computer before, maybe not likely if you're on this call, but learning how to do that, or learning a new language, something that you're excited to do, that you really need to be engaged in. That's where you're really going to see cognitive benefits.
And I just wanted to, Dr. Andersen mentioned supplements. So I'm a little known about being a very outspoken critic of the anti-aging industry and things like hormones, growth hormone, testosterone, which can be very bad for you, in fact, and very, very expensive. But the supplements, for the most part, are just burning a hole through your wallet. And I see Premagen lately, it's been advertised a lot. And there's no way that works, okay? And they get sued, and they just earn so much money from all their marketing and what have you. They've set aside a good chunk of money to pay the lawyers to deal with the lawsuits, and even if the government is going after them. And it's just I'm sorry, it's a very sad commentary, particularly in the United States, that people can get away with selling what I say are lies. and hopefully for the most part, many of these things are not bad for you, but they're certainly not doing any good. And they're just stealing money from you, and you don't want to give money to people who are trying to steal it from you. So please stay away from this stuff. I haven't seen any of that seems to do any good.
And I'll just add one more thing. If you're interested in learning more about healthy behaviors that you can modify to help you live longer and healthier, I recommend going to the livingto100.com website, and there is a quiz that you can take, and it can provide suggestions to you of behaviors that you can modify and what you might be able to expect as an increase in your life expectancy. It's fun. So we've had a couple of questions about nutrition. We talked a little bit about the stool sample collections that we are doing. And another piece is that we will be sending our participants a food frequency questionnaire. So it asks you about what foods you eat and how many times a week or day you eat them, so that we can look at how that intersects with what we are seeing in stool. So one of the questions that came in was, what part does nutrition play as we age?
So much. I'm almost at a loss for words, but I think our diets do play a role in the shaping of what bacteria are in our guts. And it's many different species of bacteria, but there are when people try to say what a healthy diet is, like a Mediterranean diet, one of the ways it may be associated with health is the particular bacteria that thrive on that diet. And of course, then there are all the other things I already mentioned about trying to avoid meat, having a diet that's conducive to a healthy weight for you, are a few of the major things I would say. That's a whole big talk in and of itself.
And I think we'll be learning a lot more from all of the dietary data and the stool data that we'll be getting. So hopefully we can report back. Okay, another question. My mother-in-law, age 107, always had salt and pepper hair, even at her passing a few weeks ago. She had a lot of dark hair, especially in the back, and had very thick curly hair. Many of her younger friends or relatives had very white or very light gray hair. Of course, none of them were centenarians. Are there any markers for hair color for aging?
So if you're Irish, graying hair, even in your 20s and 30s, is really common. And it's going to be common in other ethnicities, and there's a genetic basis for that. Graying is, what that means is really a loss of melanin in your hair, and that's what gives the color. And there can be when people, we know that people can get gray hair from too much stress, or that the stress gets to them. President Obama, his gray hair probably came in about 5 years earlier than it might have otherwise. So how you manage your stress may be important. For some people, it can be a marker, I think, of a person aging. I think it's helpful to kind of know when your parents started to have gray hair, and when is the graying that you're experiencing, did that happen earlier or later or at about the same time? But they're just like the genetics. There can be so much variation from one ethnicity or race to another in terms of what is playing a role in how fast a person ages and their risk for aging related diseases. It's an important reason why we've recently made it an important point to recruit and enroll African Americans and Hispanics. Next on our list is we'll be working on enrolling Asians. You know, this requires translating our materials into Chinese and Japanese, other languages. So it's a big step, but it's really, really important that we collect information from as many different populations as possible, see what they have in common and what they don't.
And with that, we have just a couple of minutes remaining, so I don't think we have time for any more questions, but I do want to let you know if you put a question in the Q&A section, we'll try to reach out to you by email and get an answer to you. But you can alternatively send your additional questions to us at the email address agewell@bu.edu, and that's B as in boy, U as in university. And we will get a response to you as soon as we can. And we're hoping to do this more regularly. This was very fun. So let us know what you would like to see or hear in the future.
And I would again say thank you very much for joining us. It's great to connect with you this way. And everybody stay well. And thank you again very much.